The fire crackles softly in a shallow cave, casting orange light across rough stone walls. A figure sits close to the flames, broad-shouldered and heavy-browed, wrapping animal hide around a child. Outside, snow falls quietly over a forested valley in what we now call southern France. This is a Neanderthal. A parent, a thinking, feeling being tending to family on a cold night perhaps 60,000 years ago. The scene is calm, ordinary, and deeply familiar. You recognize it because it looks like something your own ancestors might have done. But here is where the story turns strange. This Neanderthal is not your ancestor. Not exactly. This is a different kind of human. A separate species, with a separate history stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. And at this very moment in time, this species is not alone on Earth. Far to the south, across the Mediterranean, another kind of human walks the African savanna. To the east, on the islands of Southeast Asia, yet another species hunts in tropical forests. In the highlands of Central Asia, another still survives in the cold, thin air. At one point, Earth was home to at least 9 distinct human species living simultaneously. 9 variations of the human experiment, spread across continents, each adapted to different climates, different challenges, different lives. Today, only one remains. You. What happened to the others? That question has no single answer. Some vanished abruptly. Some faded slowly across millennia. Some may have been absorbed, their genes folded quietly into our own bloodline. Why are we the only ones left? That is the mystery at the heart of this story. To understand it, we need to go back. Not just thousands of years, but millions. Back to the deep roots of the human family tree, where the branches were many and the future was not yet decided. The story of human origins is not a straight line. It is not a simple march from primitive to modern, from ape to astronaut. That version of the story is a comforting myth, one that places us at the top of an inevitable ladder. The truth is far more interesting and far more unsettling. For most of the last 2 million years, multiple species of humans existed at the same time. They made tools. They controlled fire. They buried their dead. They lived in groups, cared for the sick, and navigated complex social worlds. They were not lesser versions of us waiting to be replaced. They were complete beings, fully adapted to their environments, successful in ways we are only beginning to understand. Consider that for a moment. Imagine walking through a world where you might encounter another kind of human. Not a stranger from a distant land, but an entirely different species. Similar enough to recognize, different enough to unsettle. This was the reality of Earth for an extraordinarily long time. We tend to think of the present as normal. One planet, one human species. But in the grand sweep of our history, this situation is the exception, the anomaly, the thing that requires explanation. For millions of years, the norm was diversity. The norm was coexistence. So when did this change? And why? The answers lie scattered across continents, buried in caves, encoded in fragments of ancient bone, and hidden in the spiraling chains of our own DNA. Over the last few decades, scientists have uncovered evidence that has completely rewritten the human story. New species have been discovered. Old assumptions have been overturned. The timeline has shifted, expanded, and grown far more complicated than anyone imagined a generation ago. We now know that our genus, Homo, produced a remarkable variety of forms. Some were tall and slender, built for endurance on open plains. Others were short and stocky, adapted to island forests or frozen landscapes. Some had brains as large as ours. Others had brains much smaller, but still made sophisticated tools and survived for hundreds of thousands of years. Brain size, it turns out, is not the simple measure of success we once believed. What defined these species was not a single trait, but a constellation of adaptations. Each one represented a different answer to the same fundamental question. How do you survive in a changing world? For a very long time, many answers worked. The human family tree was lush with branches, each one supporting a viable way of being human. Then, one by one, those branches died. The disappearances did not happen all at once. They unfolded over tens of thousands of years, at different times, in different places, for what appeared to be different reasons. Some species vanished before our own species, Homo sapiens, even appeared. Others survived until remarkably recently, disappearing only within the last 50,000 years. A few may have lingered even longer, holding on in isolated pockets while the modern world took shape around them. The pattern is haunting. As Homo sapiens expanded across the globe, other human species declined. Correlation is not causation, scientists remind us. But the timing is difficult to ignore. Did we outcompete them? Did we absorb them? Did we destroy them? Or did the world simply change in ways that favored us and doomed them? These questions will guide us through everything that follows. But before we can explore the disappearances, we need to understand who these species were. We need to meet them. And to do that, we must travel back to the beginning, to Africa, to the place where the very first humans took their first uncertain steps into a world that did not yet know what they would become. The journey begins millions of years ago, in a landscape of open grasslands and scattered trees, where a small, upright creature picked up a stone and changed everything. That story is next. Chapter 2. The world of many humans picture the Earth 50,000 years ago. The continents sit in roughly the same positions they occupy today. The oceans are familiar. The mountains, the rivers, the broad sweep of geography would be recognizable to modern eyes. But the world itself would feel profoundly different. The climate is colder. Vast ice sheets cover much of northern Europe and North America. Sea levels are lower, exposing land bridges that connect islands to mainlands. Forests and grasslands shift with the seasons in patterns unlike anything we know today. And across this world, humans walk. Not one kind of human, many kinds. In Europe, the Neanderthals have lived for over 300,000 years. They are stocky, immensely strong, with barrel chests and short, powerful limbs adapted to conserve heat. Their brains are as large as ours, sometimes larger. They hunt large game in coordinated groups. They make sophisticated stone tools using techniques that require planning and skill. They use fire. They make simple clothing from animal hides. They bury their dead. In several caves across Europe and the Middle East, archaeologists have found Neanderthal burials that appear deliberate, bodies placed in specific positions, sometimes accompanied by objects, sometimes surrounded by traces of flowers. Whether these burials indicate spiritual belief is debated, but they suggest something important. These were beings who noticed death, who responded to it with intention. The Neanderthals are perhaps the best known of our lost relatives, but they are far from the only ones. Travel east from Europe, deep into the mountains of Central Asia, and you encounter another species, the Denisovans. We know remarkably little about what they looked like. Their existence was discovered not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a single finger bone found in a Siberian cave. That tiny fragment of bone, analyzed for its ancient DNA, revealed a population of humans genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. They were their own kind, with their own history stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Subsequent genetic analysis has revealed something astonishing. Denisovan DNA lives on today in modern human populations across Asia, Melanesia, and Australia. Some populations carry as much as 5% Denisovan ancestry. This means that Denisovans and our ancestors met. They interacted. They had children together. The Denisovans vanished as a species, but pieces of them survived inside us. Now travel south and east, to the islands of Southeast Asia. Here the story grows even stranger. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, scientists discovered the remains of a tiny human species. Standing barely over 3 feet tall, with a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's, Homo floresiensis defied every assumption about what a human species needed to be. They made stone tools. They hunted small elephants and giant rats. They may have used fire. And they survived until perhaps 50,000 years ago, possibly even more recently. The discovery shocked the scientific world. How could a species with such a small brain exhibit such complex behavior? The answer is still debated, but it forced researchers to rethink the relationship between brain size and capability. Homo floresiensis may have been a descendant of an earlier human species that reached the island and then, isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, shrank in body and brain. This phenomenon, called island dwarfism, is well documented in other animals, but it had never been seen in humans before. On another Indonesian island, Luzon in the Philippines, yet another species was recently identified. Homo luzonensis, known from a handful of bones and teeth, appears to have been another small-bodied island human, distinct from floresiensis. Its discovery, announced only in 2019, confirmed that island Southeast Asia was a laboratory of human evolution. Isolated populations evolving in different directions, producing forms that no one had predicted. Meanwhile, back in Africa, our own species was already present. Homo sapiens had emerged roughly 300,000 years ago, though the exact timing and location remain subjects of active research. But Africa was not home to sapiens alone. Evidence suggests that other archaic human populations persisted in Africa alongside our ancestors for tens of thousands of years. Genetic studies of modern African populations reveal traces of interbreeding with unknown archaic species, ghost populations whose bones have not yet been found. These ghost lineages haunt the edges of our understanding. We know they existed because their DNA signature appears in living people. But we do not know what they looked like, how they lived, or when they finally disappeared. Africa, the birthplace of humanity, was also a continent of human diversity. Multiple lineages coexisted, interacted, and sometimes merged across the vast and varied landscapes of the continent. This is the picture that modern science has assembled. 50,000 years ago, Earth hosted a remarkable collection of human species. Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia, Homo floresiensis on Flores, Homo luzonensis on Luzon, Homo sapiens in Africa and beyond, and possibly others we have not yet discovered. Each species had its own story, its own trajectory through deep time, its own adaptations, its own culture, its own way of being human. They were not all in contact with one another. Thousands of miles and formidable geographic barriers separated many of these populations. But they shared the planet, breathed the same air, looked up at the same stars. And within a remarkably short span of time, measured in tens of thousands of years, all of them except one would be gone. That fact deserves to sit with you for a moment. Let it settle. For millions of years, the human family was a sprawling, diverse group. And then, in what amounts to an evolutionary instant, it collapsed to a single surviving lineage. Something happened, something profound and far-reaching. And to understand what it was, we need to go much further back in time. We need to return to the very beginning, to the first creatures that we can genuinely call human. We need to meet the first toolmakers. The beings who started everything lived in a world vastly different from the one we have been describing. Their story begins not 50,000 years ago, but closer to 3 million years before the present day. It begins with a stone, a hand, and an idea. Chapter 3. The First Toolmakers. Africa, roughly 2.5 million years ago. The landscape is a mosaic of grasslands, woodlands, and lake shores. The climate has been shifting, growing cooler and drier over millions of years, thinning the forests and expanding the open spaces between them. In this changing world, a small creature walks upright. It stands perhaps 4 feet tall. Its arms are longer in proportion to its body than yours. Its face juts forward, with a heavy brow and a sloping forehead. Its brain is larger than any ape's, but still less than half the size of a modern human brain. This is Homo habilis, the handy human, named for what it left behind. In the sediments of Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, archaeologists discovered simple stone tools alongside the bones of this species. These tools are crude by later standards. River cobbles struck with another stone to produce a sharp, flaking edge. But do not dismiss them. Those simple flakes represent a revolution. To make even the most basic stone tool, you must hold a concept in your mind. You must look at a round, smooth stone and envision the sharp edge hidden inside it. You must understand cause and effect. Strike here, at this angle, with this force, and the stone will fracture predictably. This is not something any other animal has ever done. Many animals use tools. Chimpanzees use sticks to extract termites. Crows bend wire to retrieve food. But no other species takes a raw material and reshapes it according to a mental template. That cognitive leap, from using what nature provides to deliberately manufacturing something new, is arguably the most important moment in the entire human story. Homo habilis made these tools for a purpose. The sharp flakes were used to cut meat from carcasses, to scrape hides, to process plant materials. They opened up new food sources that were previously inaccessible. Meat, in particular, was a game changer. Rich in calories and essential fatty acids, meat provided the energy needed to fuel a growing brain. And a growing brain, in turn, enabled more sophisticated tool use, better planning, more effective cooperation. This feedback loop between tools, diet, and brain development would drive human evolution for the next 2 million years. But Homo habilis was not the only early human on the scene. Around the same time, and in the same regions of East Africa, another species lived. Homo rudolfensis, known from a small number of fossils, appears to have been a close relative of habilis. Slightly larger-brained, with a flatter face, Rudolfensis remains mysterious and debated. Some scientists argue it is a separate species. Others think it may be a variant of habilis. The fossils are few and fragmentary, making definitive classification difficult. This uncertainty is itself revealing. It tells us that the early stages of the human lineage were messy, complex, and far from the neat linear progression depicted in textbook diagrams. There was no single founding species that gave rise to all later humans in a clean, orderly sequence. Instead, there was a bush of closely related forms, living side by side, competing for similar resources, perhaps even interacting with one another. This pattern of diversity at the base of the human family tree mirrors what we see later, when multiple species coexisted across the globe. Coexistence was not the exception in human evolution. It was the rule. Homo habilis and its relatives lived in a world full of dangers. Large predators, including saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and massive crocodiles, were constant threats. Early humans were not apex predators. They were prey as often as they were hunters. The tools they made were survival equipment. A sharp flake could mean the difference between eating and starving, between processing a scavenged carcass quickly and being driven off by competitors. Life for Homo habilis was precarious. Infant mortality was likely extremely high. Life expectancy was short. But the species persisted for several 100,000 years, a remarkable span of time by any measure. During this period, something else was happening. Brains were getting larger. Bodies were changing. New species were emerging. Around 2 million years ago, a new kind of human appeared in East Africa. Taller, leaner, longer-legged, and significantly larger brained than habilis. This species represented a dramatic shift in the human story. This was Homo erectus. And with erectus, everything changed. But before we follow that story, pause for a moment and consider what the toolmakers achieved. They were small, vulnerable creatures in a dangerous world. They lacked the speed of predators, the strength of great apes, the natural weapons of almost every large animal around them. What they had was a brain capable of innovation and hands capable of precision. With those two gifts, they began to reshape their relationship with the natural world. Not through physical dominance, but through ingenuity, through the ability to look at a problem and imagine a solution that did not yet exist. That capacity, born in the minds of Homo habilis on the African plains, would eventually carry their descendants to every corner of the globe. It would enable the construction of cities, the invention of language, the creation of art, the exploration of space. But all of that lay impossibly far in the future. For now, the toolmakers simply survived. They chipped stones, cut meat, watched the horizon for predators, and raised their young in a world that offered no guarantees. They were the beginning, the fragile, improbable beginning of everything we are. Their tools, scattered in ancient sediments across East Africa, are the oldest evidence of a mind reaching beyond the present moment, reaching towards something that did not yet exist and willing it into being. From that first struck flake, a lineage would grow that would eventually produce beings capable of contemplating their own origins. Beings like you, listening to this story now, wondering about the creatures who came before. The toolmakers did not know what they were starting. They could not have imagined where their small innovations would lead, but they started it nonetheless. And among their descendants, one species would rise to do something no human had done before. It would leave Africa. It would cross deserts and mountains and seas. It would spread to nearly every habitable corner of the earth. That species was Homo erectus. And its story is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the entire saga of life on this planet. Chapter 4. The species that conquered the world. Imagine standing on the shore of an ancient lake in East Africa, 1.8 million years ago. The water is calm in the early morning light. Flamingos wade in the shallows. Crocodiles bask on the muddy banks. In the distance, a volcano trails a thin plume of smoke into a pale sky. A figure walks along the shore, tall, upright, purposeful. This is not the small, somewhat awkward form of Homo habilis. This individual stands nearly 6 feet tall. The body is lean, long-limbed, built for endurance. The gait is smooth and efficient, unmistakably human in its rhythm. This is Homo erectus. Looking at this individual, you would see something recognizably like yourself. The proportions are modern. The posture is fully upright. The stride is long and confident. Only the face would give you pause. A heavy brow ridge, a sloping forehead, a jaw more prominent than yours. But the body below the neck would pass almost without notice on a modern street, given appropriate clothing. Homo erectus represents a turning point in human evolution so dramatic that some researchers consider it the true beginning of the human story. Everything before was prologue. With erectus, the main narrative begins. What made this species so different from its predecessors? Several things, all interconnected. First, the body. Homo erectus was the first human species with fully modern body proportions. Long legs, short arms, a narrow waist, broad shoulders. This body plan was built for one thing above all others: walking and running long distances. On the open African savanna, where forests had thinned and grasslands stretched to the horizon, endurance was survival. Homo erectus could cover enormous distances in a single day, far more than any earlier human species. This mobility opened up new possibilities. New hunting grounds, new food sources, new territories, and eventually, new continents. Second, the brain. Homo erectus had a significantly larger brain than habilis. Not as large as modern humans, but large enough to support more complex behavior, more sophisticated planning, more effective social coordination. With that larger brain came new technologies. Homo erectus developed the Acheulean hand axe, one of the most successful tools in human history. Shaped on both sides into a symmetrical teardrop form, the hand axe was versatile, effective, and remarkably standardized. Hand axes have been found across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The same basic design, repeated with minor variations across 1,000,000 years and multiple continents. This consistency suggests that the knowledge of how to make them was transmitted from generation to generation through teaching and imitation. This is culture. Not culture in the modern sense of art galleries and symphonies, but culture in its deepest, most fundamental sense. The passing of learned behavior from one generation to the next. Homo erectus added. Third, fire. The evidence is debated, but many researchers believe Homo erectus was the first human species to control fire. Burned bones and charred plant remains at sites in Africa and the Middle East suggest deliberate use of fire as early as 1,000,000 years ago. Fire changed everything. It provided warmth, extending the range of habitable environments. It provided light, extending the usable hours of each day. It provided protection from predators. And perhaps most importantly, it enabled cooking. Cooking transforms food. It breaks down tough fibers, kills parasites, and releases nutrients that raw food locks away. Cooked food delivers more energy per bite, requiring less time spent chewing and digesting. This freed up energy for the brain, which is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body. The relationship between fire, cooking, and brain development may have been one of the most important feedback loops in human evolution. More fire meant better food. Better food meant bigger brains. Bigger brains meant better control of fire. With these advantages, Homo erectus did something unprecedented. It left Africa. The earliest evidence of erectus outside Africa comes from the site of Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, dated to approximately 1.8 million years ago. Remarkably, this is almost as old as the earliest African erectus fossils. This suggests that the expansion out of Africa happened rapidly, perhaps within just a few 100,000 years of the species' emergence. Once erectus started moving, it moved fast. From the Caucasus, population spread in multiple directions. East across southern Asia, reaching China and Indonesia, west into Europe. And in each new environment, they adapted. In tropical Southeast Asia, erectus populations hunted along river valleys and coastal plains. In temperate China, they sheltered in caves and may have used fire to survive cold winters. In the islands of Indonesia, they persisted for over 1,000,000 years. The geographic range of Homo erectus was staggering. No previous human species had occupied more than a small portion of Africa. Erectus occupied 3 continents. From the Atlantic coast of Africa to the Pacific coast of Asia, from the temperate forests of Europe to the tropical islands of Java. This was the first great human expansion. The first time a member of our genus truly conquered the world. And it lasted an extraordinarily long time. Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2,000,000 years, making it by far the most successful human species in terms of longevity. By comparison, Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. We have a long way to go before we match the record of erectus. During those 2,000,000 years, erectus populations diverged. Separated by vast distances, adapted to different climates and different landscapes, they evolved along different paths. Some of these divergent populations may have given rise to new species entirely. The Neanderthals of Europe, the Denisovans of Asia, the small island humans of Southeast Asia, all may trace their ancestry back to populations of Homo erectus that left Africa and then evolved in isolation for hundreds of thousands of years. If this is true, then Homo erectus is not just a chapter in the human story. It is the trunk of the tree from which nearly all later human diversity grew. And yet, for all its success, Homo erectus eventually vanished. The last known erectus population survived in Indonesia until perhaps 100,000 years ago, possibly even more recently. By that time, the world had changed profoundly. New human species had arisen. New technologies had been developed. New pressures were building. The era of Homo erectus was ending, and the era that would follow would be defined by a level of competition between human species that the world had never seen before. Multiple species, each armed with tools and fire and culture, each adapted to its own environment, each pursuing its own survival strategy. For a time, they coexisted. They shared the planet, sometimes even shared the same valleys and caves. But coexistence would not last forever. Something was coming. Something that would tip the balance, collapse the diversity, and leave only one species standing. That something was already taking shape in Africa. A new kind of human was emerging. Slender-boned, large-brained, and possessed of a cognitive capacity that would prove unlike anything the world had ever seen. This new species would not just adapt to its environment, it would reshape it. It would not just survive in the world, it would reimagine it. And when it finally began to spread beyond Africa, everything would change. For every human species on Earth, what happened when Homo sapiens met its closest relatives? What unfolded when our ancestors came face to face with the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and the other humans who had called this planet home for hundreds of thousands of years? The answer to that question is one of the most fascinating and troubling chapters in our entire history. And that story begins next. Chapter 5. The humans of ice and shadow imagine a world locked in ice. Glaciers stretch across northern Europe like a white continent. Temperatures plunge far below anything modern humans would willingly endure. The wind carries snow sideways across treeless plains. Nothing about this landscape invites survival. Yet someone is thriving here. Not merely surviving, thriving. Building shelters. Hunting the largest and most dangerous animals on Earth. Raising children who will grow stronger than any human alive today. Passing knowledge from generation to generation across thousands of centuries. The Neanderthals owned this frozen world. We need to dismantle everything popular culture has taught you about these people. Forget the slouching, dim-witted caveman dragging a club. That image was constructed in the 19th century by scientists who needed Neanderthals to be inferior. The evidence tells a radically different story. A Neanderthal man stood roughly 5 feet 5 inches tall. His bones were twice as thick as yours. His muscle attachments suggest a grip strength that would crush a modern athlete's hand. His barrel chest housed lungs adapted to cold, thin air. His brain was larger than yours. Read that again. The average Neanderthal brain measured approximately 1,600 cubic centimeters. The average modern human brain measures roughly 1,400. Whatever happened to Neanderthals? It was not because they lacked cognitive hardware. Something more complicated was at work. Their world stretched from Portugal to Siberia, from the Mediterranean coast to the edge of glacial sheets. They occupied this enormous range for over 300,000 years. For context, modern civilization is roughly 10,000 years old. Neanderthals lasted 30 times longer. What did they do with all that time? They made tools of extraordinary sophistication. The Mousterian toolkit, named after the rock shelter of Le Moustier in France, included carefully shaped points, scrapers, and blades. Each tool required planning, understanding of stone fracture mechanics, and fine motor control. They controlled fire reliably. Hearth sites across Europe show repeated, structured burning. They position fires for warmth, light, and cooking. Some sites show evidence of fire being used to harden wooden spear tips, transforming simple sticks into lethal weapons. They hunted cooperatively. Isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones reveals diets dominated by large herbivores. Woolly mammoths, giant aurochs, steppe bison. These animals weighed over 1,000 pounds. Killing them required coordinated group strategy, not individual bravery. They buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, excavations revealed Neanderthal burials surrounded by flower pollen. The interpretation remains debated, but the burials themselves are not. Bodies were deliberately placed in prepared positions. Dirt was carefully arranged. These were not accidental deaths in convenient locations. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, an elderly Neanderthal male was found in a rectangular pit. This individual had lost most of his teeth long before death. His spine showed severe arthritis. He could not have fed himself or survived alone. Someone cared for him for years. This fact alone should reshape your understanding. A species that keeps its elderly alive, despite enormous cost, is not operating on pure instinct. Compassion requires imagination. You must conceive of another being suffering and choose to alleviate it. They also created. In 2018, researchers confirmed that paintings in 3 Spanish caves were made by Neanderthals. Red ochre hand stencils in geometric shapes dated to at least 65,000 years ago, 20,000 years before modern humans reached Europe. Neanderthals were artists before we arrived. They fashioned jewelry from eagle talons and colored shells. They used pigments on their bodies. At one Italian site, they collected specific feathers from birds of prey, apparently for decoration rather than any practical purpose. They had language. While we cannot hear their words, their hyoid bone, critical for speech, was virtually identical to ours. Their FOXP2 gene, linked to language capacity, matched the modern human version. The anatomy for complex speech was present. So here is your mystery, sharpened to a point. A species with larger brains, greater physical strength, sophisticated technology, artistic expression, language capability, cooperative hunting, medical care, and 300,000 years of successful adaptation to Earth's harshest environments. They dominated an entire continent. And then they vanished. Between roughly 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations collapsed across Europe. Within 5,000 years, a species that had weathered dozens of ice ages simply ceased to exist. Their last known refuge was Gibraltar, the southern tip of Spain. Picture that final population. A small group huddled at the edge of a continent their ancestors had ruled. Behind them, the entire landmass now belonged to newcomers. Ahead, only ocean. There was nowhere left to go. What force could erase such a successful species so completely? The answer walked on 2 legs. It carried lighter tools, spoke in complex syntax, and traveled in larger groups. It had crossed continents and oceans. It was relentless, adaptive, and utterly unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. It was us. But the story is not that simple. Because when Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, something happened that no one predicted. Something written in your very cells. Something that challenges the idea that these were truly separate species at all. We will return to that revelation. First, we must travel east. Chapter 6. The Hidden Humans of Asia. In 2008, a Russian archaeologist named Alexander Sibankov was excavating in a remote cave in Siberia's Altai Mountains. The cave was called Denisova, named after an 18th century hermit. It was cold, small, and seemingly unremarkable. His team found a tiny bone, a fragment of a child's pinky finger. It was so small it could have been mistaken for an animal bone. It nearly was. Only the decision to send it for genetic analysis rather than physical classification changed everything. What happened next rewired our understanding of human evolution. Svante Pääbo's laboratory in Leipzig, Germany, extracted ancient DNA from that finger bone. The genetic sequence that emerged did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals. It represented something entirely unknown. A ghost made suddenly, shockingly real. The Denisovans had entered the scientific record without a face. Think about what that means. We discovered an entire species of human being, not through skulls or skeletons, but through molecules. We know their genetic code better than their anatomy. We can read their DNA, but cannot describe what they looked like. This is paleontology turned upside down. For 2 centuries, the discipline relied on bones and stone tools. Physical evidence you could hold and measure. The Denisovans proved that the deepest secrets of human history might be invisible to the naked eye. From that single finger bone and a handful of additional fragments, a picture slowly emerged. Denisovans diverged from Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago. They shared a common ancestor with both Neanderthals and modern humans. They were our cousins, close cousins. Their geographic range appears to have been enormous. While Denisova Cave sits in southern Siberia, their genetic legacy tells a story of vast Asian occupation. Traces of Denisovan DNA appear in populations from Tibet to Australia, from the Philippines to Papua New Guinea. Modern Melanesian populations carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. Some Tibetan populations carry a specific Denisovan gene variant called EPIS, one that helps them survive at extreme altitudes. Denisovans gave Tibetans the ability to breathe on the roof of the world. That gene did not evolve independently. It was inherited through interbreeding. In 2019, researchers used methylation patterns in Denisovan DNA to reconstruct a rough physical portrait. Wide skull, protruding jaw, low forehead, large dental arch. These were robust, powerfully built people adapted to demanding environments across Asia. But the Denisovans are only the beginning of Asia's hidden story. In 2010, the same year Denisovans were announced, researchers confirmed that Homo floresiensis had survived on the island of Flores until approximately 50,000 years ago. 3-foot-tall humans with brains the size of grapefruits had been making stone tools and hunting pygmy elephants. On Luzon in the Philippines, Homo luzonensis was formally described in 2019. This species showed a bizarre mosaic of features. Curved finger bones suggesting climbing ability, combined with small teeth resembling modern humans. Another island, another impossible combination. How many more species wait in Asia's caves and islands? The honest answer is that we do not know. Asia's fossil record is far less explored than Africa's or Europe's. Vast regions of China, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia remain archaeologically uncharted. Every expedition risks finding something that rewrites the textbooks. And then there are the ghosts. Statistical analysis of modern human DNA in Asia reveals signatures of interbreeding with populations that match no known species. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not any fossil in any museum. These are genetic phantoms, detected only through their echo in living people. At least 2 such ghost populations have been identified in Australasian genomes. One appears to have been closely related to Denisovans, but genetically distinct. The other remains entirely mysterious. They existed. They interbred with our ancestors. They left no bones. Consider the implications. The traditional model showed a few well-known species occupying separate continents. Africa had its lineages. Europe had Neanderthals. Asia had Homo erectus. The reality is proving far messier, far richer, and far more crowded. 50,000 years ago, Asia was a continent of human diversity almost beyond comprehension. Multiple species and populations occupied different ecological zones. Mountains, islands, forests, and coastlines each sheltered their own human story. The Denisovans themselves may not have been a single population. Genetic evidence suggests at least 3 distinct Denisovan groups existed, separated by geography and time. They were as different from each other as they were from Neanderthals. We have been thinking too small. The old image of a few scattered human species sharing the planet was wrong. The emerging picture suggests dozens of populations, some isolated for hundreds of thousands of years, each adapting to unique environments in unique ways. A human archipelago of diversity. and Homo sapiens walked into all of it. Our ancestors did not encounter one or two other species during their expansion out of Africa. They encountered a world teeming with different kinds of humans. Each encounter posed the same questions: friend or threat, mate or competitor, neighbor or enemy. What happened during those encounters determined who survived. The evidence of those meetings is written in two places: in the ground, where archaeology preserves tools, bones, and the remains of ancient camps, and in our genomes, where every act of interbreeding left a permanent record. The ground tells one story, the DNA tells another. Together, they reveal something extraordinary and unsettling about the nature of our species, something that happened when humans met other humans for the first and last time. Chapter 7. When humans met each other, the first meeting probably happened without ceremony. Two groups spotting each other across a valley. Figures moving through trees at the edge of vision. Unfamiliar silhouettes against a familiar landscape. Curiosity, caution, the slow, terrifying recognition of something almost like yourself. Almost, but not quite. We will never recover the details of that first contact. No written record exists. No oral tradition survives from so deep in time. But the evidence of what followed is overwhelming, contradictory, and forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. The archaeological record shows that when Homo sapiens entered Neanderthal territory in Europe roughly 45,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations began declining within millennia. Correlation does not prove causation, but the timing is devastating. Site after site tells the same story. Layers of Neanderthal occupation, consistent and unbroken for thousands of years, suddenly end. Above them, modern human artifacts appear. The transition is sometimes gradual, sometimes it is abrupt, but the direction never reverses. The Neanderthals did not come back. One hypothesis is direct violence. Modern humans may have systematically killed Neanderthals in territorial conflicts. There is some evidence for this. Neanderthal bones occasionally show injuries consistent with projectile weapons that only Homo sapiens possessed at the time. But genocide alone cannot explain the pattern. Neanderthal populations were spread across millions of square miles. Modern human groups were small. A species does not exterminate another across a continent through combat alone. Something more pervasive was at work. Competition offers a subtler explanation. If modern humans were even slightly more efficient at extracting resources from the same environments, the math becomes lethal over generations. A 1% advantage in caloric intake, compounded across centuries, could push Neanderthals toward extinction. Modern humans may have had larger social networks. Archaeological evidence suggests sapiens groups maintained contact over hundreds of miles, trading materials and likely sharing information. Neanderthal networks appear smaller and more localized. In times of crisis, connections save lives. Modern humans also had projectile weapons. Spear throwers and eventually bows allowed killing at a distance. Neanderthals used thrusting spears requiring close contact with dangerous prey. The difference in hunting injury rates would have been significant across populations. But here is where the story fractures, because the DNA evidence tells us something the bones alone never could. Modern humans and Neanderthals did not simply compete. They did not merely coexist at arm's length across contested boundaries. They were intimate with each other. Every person of non-African descent alive today carries between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Billions of people. This is not a trace amount. This is not an anomaly from a single encounter. This represents sustained, repeated interbreeding across thousands of years. Let that settle. The species we supposedly drove to extinction also shared our beds. They raised children with us. Those children survived, reproduced, and passed Neanderthal genes forward through every subsequent generation. Their DNA flows through you as you read these words. The interbreeding was not trivial in its consequences. Neanderthal gene variants in modern humans affect immune function, skin pigmentation, hair texture, sleep patterns, and susceptibility to certain diseases. Some variants were beneficial. Natural selection preserved them because they helped. Our immune systems are partly Neanderthal. Genes inherited from Neanderthals helped modern humans fight European pathogens they had never previously encountered. The interbreeding may have been essential to Sapiens' survival in new environments. We needed them. But some inherited Neanderthal variants carry costs. Certain Neanderthal gene segments are associated with increased risk of depression, blood clotting disorders, and autoimmune conditions. The merger of two long-separated genomes produced both gifts and burdens. The Denisovan interbreeding story is equally complex. Modern Melanesian populations carry roughly 5% Denisovan DNA. Asian populations carry smaller amounts. The high-altitude adaptation gene EPase-1 in Tibetans is Denisovan. Without that gift from an extinct species, Tibet might be uninhabitable today. DNA evidence reveals at least 3 separate interbreeding events between modern humans and Denisovans. Each event involved a different Denisovan population. Our ancestors did not encounter one group of Denisovans. They met several, across different times and places. And then there are the African ghost lineages. In 2020, researchers identified DNA segments in West African populations that originated from an unknown archaic human species. This group diverged from the modern human lineage roughly 500,000 years ago. They have no name. They have no fossils. They exist only as code. The interbreeding happened within the last 50,000 years. Modern humans in Africa were mating with archaic relatives just as their cousins in Europe were mating with Neanderthals, and their cousins in Asia were mating with Denisovans. The pattern was universal. Everywhere Homo sapiens went, interbreeding followed. This forces a profound question. Were these truly separate species? The biological species concept defines species as populations that cannot produce fertile offspring together. But that is exactly what happened. Fertile offspring were produced. They thrived. Their descendants number in billions. Perhaps the boundaries between human species were always more permeable than we assumed. Perhaps the neat categories of our textbooks impose order on a reality that was fluid, messy, and deeply interconnected. Perhaps the tree of human evolution is actually a braided river. But the interbreeding did not save anyone. This is the darkness at the heart of the story. Modern humans mated with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals still vanished. Modern humans carried Denisovan children, and Denisovans still disappeared. Intimacy did not prevent extinction. Love, if we can call it that, was not enough. What does it mean when absorption and elimination happen simultaneously? When you embrace another people and erase them in the same gesture? When their genes survive but their cultures, languages, identities, and independent existence are annihilated? The word for this is not extinction. It is something without a clean name. By 30,000 years ago, the process was nearly complete. Neanderthals were gone. Denisovans had vanished from their last refuges. The island humans of Flores and Luzon had disappeared. Every archaic lineage on Earth was either extinct or absorbed. One species remained, alone, victorious by any measure, possessing a planet for the first time in 3 million years of shared human existence. The diversity that had defined our family since its origin had been reduced to a single surviving line. And now that single species stood at the threshold of something unprecedented. No longer competing with other humans for resources and territory, Homo sapiens began to change the world in ways no previous species had imagined. Art, agriculture, cities, empires. But there is a final piece of evidence that changes everything. Something found not in ancient caves or fragmentary bones, but in the cells of people alive today. Something that suggests the story of extinction is not yet finished. Something that forces us to ask whether those lost species are truly gone, or whether they are still here, hidden inside us, waiting to be understood. Chapter 8. The world begins to empty. Imagine a map of the world 60,000 years ago. Light it up wherever a human species lives. Africa glows. Europe glows. Asia burns bright from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Indonesia flickers with life on isolated islands. The map is crowded with humanity. Now watch what happens next. The lights begin to go out. Not all at once. Not in a single catastrophic moment. They fade slowly, one by one, like stars disappearing before dawn. Each vanishing light represents something that took hundreds of thousands of years to create. Gone. The first to dim are the most isolated. On the island of Flores, the small-bodied humans who hunted pygmy elephants and dodged Komodo dragons had survived for hundreds of thousands of years. They had fire. They had stone tools. They had adapted perfectly to their island world. Their brains were small, but effective. Around 50,000 years ago, the archaeological record on Flores changes. The stone tools shift in style. The animal bones in the caves belong to different species. Something new has arrived on the island, and the old inhabitants are nowhere to be found. We do not know if they met face to face. We do not know if there was a single dramatic encounter. The fossil record is not a camera. It captures only fragments. But the pattern is consistent. After the new arrivals appear, the old residents vanish. Homo floresiensis disappears from the record. On Luzon in the Philippines, the same pattern emerges. Homo luzonensis had colonized a large island, survived in tropical forests, and developed its own distinct anatomy. It was a successful species by every meaningful measure. Then it too vanishes from the fossil record. The timing is uncertain. The evidence is fragmentary. But the direction is always the same. Diversity decreases. The number of human species on Earth begins to shrink. Turn now to mainland Asia. The Denisovans had occupied an enormous geographic range. From the frozen mountains of Siberia to the tropical latitudes where they interbred with ancestors of modern Melanesians, they were spread across thousands of miles. Their genetic signature tells us they were not one uniform population. At least 3 distinct Denisovan groups have been identified through DNA analysis. They were diverse within themselves. They were adapting to radically different environments across a vast continent. Yet they too begin to disappear. The timing overlaps with the expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa and across southern Asia. Between 60 and 45,000 years ago, modern humans moved rapidly along coastlines and through river valleys. They carried new technologies and new behaviors. Everywhere they went, the older populations declined. This is not a claim of simple conquest. The evidence does not support a narrative of armies clashing on ancient battlefields. There are no mass graves. There are no fortifications. Whatever happened was slower and more complex than war. But it was no less total. In Europe, the Neanderthals had weathered ice ages that would have destroyed less resilient peoples. They had survived for 300,000 years. They had art, ritual, medicine, and language capacity. They were not fragile. They were not primitive. Around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens entered Europe. The two species coexisted for roughly 5,000 years. 5,000 years is longer than all of recorded human history. It is not a brief overlap. It is a long, slow entanglement. During those 5,000 years, the Neanderthal population shrank. Their geographic range contracted. They retreated from open landscapes into mountainous terrain and coastal edges. They concentrated in refugia, pockets of survival in an increasingly sapiens-dominated world. Gibraltar was one of the last. The caves at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula contain Neanderthal remains dating to roughly 40,000 years ago. perhaps later. Some researchers argue they survived even longer in this rocky fortress overlooking the strait between Europe and Africa. Imagine being among the last. Imagine your people, once stretching from Wales to Uzbekistan, and now reduced to a handful of families clinging to a limestone cliff above the sea. Behind you, the continent belongs to someone else now. The fires still burn in the caves. The tools are still made with practiced skill. Children are still born and named and taught to hunt. Life continues. But the world has contracted to a point. This was happening everywhere simultaneously. In Africa, ghost lineages detected only through modern DNA were also declining. We cannot see them in the fossil record. We know them only as statistical shadows, but the math is clear. They were vanishing. Between 50 and 30,000 years ago, the number of human species on Earth dropped from at least 9 to 1. That is the steepest collapse of human diversity in the entire 3 million year history of our genus. It happened in a geological instant. The map that once blazed with multiple colors now shows only one. Every light is the same light now. Every human on Earth belongs to a single lineage. The grand experiment of human diversity, millions of years of parallel evolution across multiple continents, has ended. Only we remain. The world has begun to empty, and it will not refill. Chapter 9. The possible reasons they vanished. Why did they all disappear? This is the question that haunts every researcher who studies human evolution. It is simple to ask and fiendishly difficult to answer. The evidence is fragmentary. The timelines are uncertain, and the truth is almost certainly not a single explanation, but a convergence. Let us examine each possibility. The first explanation is climate change. The period between 60 and 30,000 years ago was one of dramatic climatic instability. Ice sheets advanced and retreated across northern latitudes. Sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. Entire ecosystems shifted or collapsed. Neanderthals had survived previous ice ages, but the glacial cycles of this period were particularly severe. The Heinrich events, episodes of massive iceberg discharge into the North Atlantic, caused rapid cooling across Europe. Forests shrank. Game animals migrated or died. Neanderthal populations were already small. Estimates suggest the total Neanderthal population of Europe at any given time may have numbered only in the tens of thousands. Small populations are vulnerable to environmental shocks. A few bad decades can push a species toward collapse. Climate change alone could have reduced Neanderthal numbers to unsustainable levels. The same applies to Denisovans in northern Asia, where glacial conditions were even more extreme. Cold-adapted they were, but adaptation has limits when the environment changes faster than biology can follow. But climate change does not explain everything. The island species of Southeast Asia lived in tropical environments far from the ice sheets. Flores and Luzon experienced climate fluctuations, but nothing comparable to European glaciation. Their disappearances require a different mechanism. The second explanation is competition. When Homo sapiens arrived in new territories, they entered ecosystems already occupied by established human populations. They competed for the same prey, the same shelters, the same resources. Even without direct conflict, this competition could have been devastating. Sapiens may have had a slight edge. The archaeological evidence suggests that modern humans arriving in Europe brought more diverse toolkits, used projectile weapons more effectively, and exploited a wider range of food sources, including fish, birds, and plant materials. A 2% advantage in caloric efficiency does not sound dramatic, but compounded over centuries, it transforms landscapes. The group that extracts slightly more energy from an environment grows slightly faster. Over generations, that difference becomes dominance. This is not about intelligence. Neanderthals were intelligent. It is about ecological strategy. A species that exploits more niches, that adapts its diet and technology more rapidly to local conditions. will eventually outcompete a specialist population. This is basic ecology. Computer models support this interpretation. Simulations published in multiple journals show that even minimal competitive advantages, applied consistently over thousands of years, produce exactly the pattern we observe. Slow decline, geographic contraction, eventual extinction. No war required, just mathematics. The third explanation is disease. When previously isolated populations meet, they exchange pathogens. The historical record of European colonialism provides devastating examples. Diseases that were manageable for one population proved catastrophic for populations with no prior exposure. Did Homo sapiens carry diseases into Europe that devastated Neanderthal populations? We cannot be certain. Ancient DNA has not yet revealed definitive evidence of specific pathogen transfer, but the theoretical framework is sound. Immunological naivety kills more efficiently than any weapon. Neanderthals and Sapiens had been separated for at least 500,000 years. That is more than enough time for each lineage to develop distinct disease environments. When they met, the exchange could have been profoundly asymmetric. The fourth explanation is absorption, and this is where the story becomes most complex. We know interbreeding occurred. The DNA evidence is unambiguous. Neanderthals and Sapiens produced fertile offspring. Denisovans and Sapiens produced fertile offspring. At least 3 separate interbreeding events with Denisovans have been confirmed. Multiple Neanderthal admixture events are documented. If 2 populations interbreed, and one is much larger, the smaller population gets genetically absorbed. Its distinct characteristics are diluted across successive generations. Its cultural practices are subsumed. Its identity as a separate group dissolves not through destruction, but through merger. This is not a comfortable concept. It means that extinction and intimacy happen simultaneously. The same generations that witnessed the decline of Neanderthal populations also witnessed the creation of mixed families. Love and loss occupied the same moment in time. The child of a Neanderthal mother and a Sapiens father would have grown up in one community or the other. Over time, in a world where Sapiens communities were larger and more numerous, more of these children would have been raised as Sapiens. Within a few centuries, the Neanderthal contribution becomes a fraction. Within a few millennia, it becomes a trace. The population has not been destroyed. It has been absorbed. But the result is the same. Neanderthals, as a distinct group, cease to exist. Now consider that all 4 mechanisms likely operated simultaneously. Climate stress reduced archaic populations. Competition with Sapiens prevented recovery. Disease accelerated decline. And interbreeding absorbed the remnants into the expanding Sapiens population. No single cause. A convergence of pressures, each insufficient alone, devastating in combination. This convergence model explains why different species disappeared at different times and in different places. The specific mix of pressures varied by region. In Europe, climate and competition dominated. In Southeast Asia, competition and absorption played larger roles. It also explains why the process took thousands of years rather than happening overnight. Extinction by convergence is slow. It looks like coexistence from the inside. Generations live and die during the process without recognizing the trajectory. Only afterward does the pattern become visible. There is one more factor that deserves consideration: population dynamics. Homo sapiens had a demographic advantage. Evidence suggests that sapiens populations grew faster, moved more frequently, and maintained larger social networks. This may have been the decisive difference. A species that can sustain larger groups can absorb losses more easily. It can recolonize abandoned territories more quickly. It can maintain genetic diversity across a wider range. Numbers matter in evolution as much as capability. The Neanderthals were brilliant, resilient, adaptive, and too few. In the end, the answer to why they vanished is not a single dramatic event. It is a long, slow accumulation of small disadvantages, each tolerable alone, fatal in combination. It is death by 1,000 cuts dealt over 10,000 years. And we were holding the knife, even if we did not know it, even if we did not mean it. Chapter 10. The last humans standing 30,000 years ago, a threshold was crossed. For the first time in 3 million years of human evolution, only one species of the genus Homo remained on Earth. There was no ceremony marking this moment. No one knew it had happened. The last Neanderthal did not know she was the last. The final Denisovan did not understand that his people had reached the end. The closing chapter of Homo floresiensis was not recorded by anyone. These endings happened in silence, unwitnessed and unmarked. This is the payoff the entire story has been building toward. Not a dramatic battle, not a triumphant conquest, but a quiet vanishing so complete that we did not even know what we had lost until we learned to read ancient bones. We are the last humans standing. That sentence should disturb you. For the vast majority of our genus's existence, multiple human species shared this planet. Coexistence was the norm. Our current solitude is the aberration. We are living in the strangest moment in human evolutionary history. Consider what was lost. Neanderthals who painted cave walls and buried their dead with flowers. Denisovans who gifted us the gene that lets Tibetans breathe at high altitude. Floresiensis who proved that human intelligence does not require a large brain. Each species represented a different answer to the question of how to be human. Each had solved the problems of survival, community, and meaning in its own way. Each carried knowledge that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years. All of it gone, except for the fragments that survive inside us. And this is the revelation that transforms the entire narrative. They are not entirely gone. You carry them with you. Right now, as you read these words, Neanderthal DNA is active in your cells. If you have East Asian or Melanesian ancestry, Denisovan genes are part of your biology. This is not metaphor. This is molecular fact. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every non-African human alive today comes from Neanderthals. In Melanesian populations, up to 5% comes from Denisovans. In some African populations, DNA from unnamed ghost lineages persists at significant levels. The species we replaced are still here. They live in our immune systems, in our skin and hair, in our ability to process certain foods, and our vulnerability to certain diseases. They are woven into the fabric of what we are. The EPase1 gene, inherited from Denisovans, allows Tibetan populations to thrive at altitudes that would incapacitate others. This gene was shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of Denisovan adaptation. When we absorbed it, we inherited their solution to a problem we had not yet faced. Neanderthal DNA variants influence our immune response to this day. Some variants increase resistance to certain pathogens. Others increase susceptibility to autoimmune conditions. The legacy is complex, neither purely beneficial nor purely harmful. It is simply part of us now. We did not merely replace them, we became partly them. This reframes the entire story of human evolution. The narrative of replacement gives way to a narrative of merger. The sharp boundaries between species dissolve. What we call Homo sapiens today is not a pure lineage. It is a composite. We are an alloy forged from multiple human species. Our genome is a palimpsest, a document written over itself, with older texts showing through beneath the surface. The Neanderthals are there. The Denisovans are there. The ghost lineages are there. Every child born today carries this inheritance. Every human body is a living archive of extinct species. The dead walk among us not as ghosts but as genes, functional sequences of DNA that continue to shape our lives in ways we are only beginning to understand. This is the answer to the question posed at the beginning. What happened to the other human species? They did not simply vanish. They were absorbed, blended, folded into a single surviving lineage that carries all of their contributions forward. But this answer opens a deeper question. If we carry their genes, do we carry an obligation to their memory? If their DNA still functions in our bodies, are they truly extinct? What does extinction mean when the boundary between self and other was never absolute? Taxonomists draw lines between species. Nature, it seems, does not. The Homo sapiens who walked out of Africa 60,000 years ago were not the same as the Homo sapiens alive today. We have been changed by every encounter, every interbreeding event, every absorbed lineage. We are the product of convergence, not purity. This is both humbling and unsettling. Humbling because it means our survival was not inevitable. It was contingent on encounters with other peoples whose contributions made us more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of surviving what came next. Unsettling because it means our success came at an extraordinary cost. 9 species reduced to 1. Millions of years of parallel human evolution collapsed into a single lineage. The greatest loss of human diversity the world has ever seen. And we are both the survivors and the cause. Sit with that for a moment. You are the inheritor of a legacy that includes both the survivors and the vanished. Your body is a memorial to species that no longer exist as distinct peoples. Their story did not end. It was folded into yours. The question is not whether we won. The question is what we lost along the way, and whether we have the wisdom to recognize the magnitude of what is gone, the humility to honor what remains inside us, and the curiosity to keep searching for what we have not yet found. Because the caves still hold secrets. The genomes still contain unread chapters. And the story of how 9 became 1 is not finished being told. We are still learning what it means to be the last human standing in a world that was once so much fuller. The map glows with a single light now, but that light contains multitudes. Here is what we know. 50,000 years ago, at least 9 human species shared this planet. They had survived ice ages, crossed oceans, colonized islands, painted caves, buried their dead, and cared for their sick. They were not failed experiments. They were complete worlds. Today, 1 species remains. We carry the others inside us, fragments of DNA that still shape how we breathe, fight disease, and endure harsh environments. They are not entirely gone. They persist in the architecture of our cells, silent passengers in a body that does not remember their names. But here is the open question that science has not yet answered. We know of 9 species. How many more existed that we have never found? The fossil record captures only a fraction of what lived. New species have been identified from a single finger bone, a single jawbone, a single set of teeth. What lies undiscovered in the unexplored caves of mainland Southeast Asia, in the river sediments of Central Africa, and the islands of the Pacific? Those lineages detected in modern DNA have no fossils. They are mathematical phantoms, populations inferred from statistical signatures in living genomes. We know they existed. We do not know what they looked like, where they lived, or what they called themselves. Every year, new analytical tools reveal deeper layers of our composite genome. Every year, the number of ancient human populations grows. The story is not converging on a simple answer. It is expanding into greater and more astonishing complexity. We are not the culmination of human evolution. We are its sole surviving branch, shaped by every other branch we touched. The tree did not narrow to us because we were the best. It narrowed because of ice and time and chance and encounters we are only beginning to understand. The last humans standing are not standing alone. We never were. The others are still here, encoded in every cell, waiting for the science to catch up with the story they have been trying to tell us for 50,000 years. If this story changed how you see yourself and our place in the long human journey, subscribe to our channel. There are more untold chapters ahead, more mysteries buried in bone and code, and we will keep searching for them together.